Good morning, everyone. I am honored to be with you here today to share with you some of the things that I have learned and that I have grown to value about adult education in a decade of research and practice in community settings. One can say I treaded the threshold of adult and community education back in 2007, when, as a newly master's in sociology graduate, I started working as a research assistant on the European Union's Sixth Framework Programme project included, more specifically, the project Strategies for Inclusion and Social Cohesion in Europe from Education. It was in the early days that definite contract basis positions started being offered at the University of Malta. So at the time, I resigned from my very well-paid, arguably high-status, surely indefinite managerial post in the private sector and started working on a definite 3-year EU research contract. I was young, or rather younger. I like to think myself as younger. I had textbook knowledge, but relatively minimum hands-on research experience. At the time, I was also pregnant, and I was also unmarried. And though in a stable relationship and with an academic, the relationship entailed differences of social, economic, and cultural capital. As said, I had textbook knowledge on sociological research, but I had negligible textbook knowledge on pregnancy, particularly on the part that recommends not to make radical changes when pregnant. Are you familiar with that part? Like, do not move house, do not move country, do not start a PhD? I wasn't. So since the research assistant job description emphasized the relevance of reading for a PhD, I was pregnant like 4 months, and I decided to embark on my PhD studies on adult education in community settings. A longitudinal action research project comprising participatory observation. The implications. I was a researcher and a research participant. More accurately, I was a female, I was a pregnant, unmarried, master's graduate, PhD candidate, employed on a definite contract, researcher, and research participant. In other words, this was the point in my life when, to say the least, although the idiom to say the least does not do justice to what followed, but yes, let us say that it was a point in my life when I was, to say the least, vulnerable. Thus, I set out with a research design comprising the engagement of a number of adults, including myself, enrolled as participants and co-investigators of a community-based educational participatory action research project. Now I'm going to explain what that entailed. The community participating in my doctoral research is a densely populated town surrounded by rural but also industrial areas. It was and still is challenged by issues such as unemployment, housing, and illiteracy problems. Notwithstanding, it is also associated with resilience, resourcefulness, and initiative, particularly through the efforts invested by the local council, the municipality, as well as a number of NGOs. In this context, back in 2007, I started off to see if and how adult education may address vulnerability, as commonly understood, or rather, as I gradually discovered, as I had always misunderstood. I was in search of a pedagogy for adults that would overcome vulnerabilities by means of empowerment, a very popularly used catchphrase and buzzword, one can say. So in other words, I was researching vulnerability as the antonym, as the opposite of being powerful. Drawing on the work of the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire, I collaborated with the local council of the community and other relevant stakeholders to set up a community-based educational initiative that brought together folk singers, writers, and cultural enthusiasts of the community. All participants were adults. The majority were older adults, pensioners, and coming from a working-class background. There were also significant internal differences within the group. A minority had tertiary level of education, including myself, because I was reading for a PhD, and my supervisor, Professor Carmel Borg from the Faculty of Education, who also collaborated in the project as a research participant himself, apart from supervisor, which created a very interesting dynamic and quite peculiar as well in the context of reading for a PhD. Whereas another minority of research participants were semi-literate. They had very little, if at all, digital skills as well. So the project was embedded in critical theory framework, fostering cultural circles of which members would problematize common experiences such as the effects of climate change, unemployment, illness, state and private provision of healthcare, or rather state versus private provision of healthcare, education, educational challenges, education and employment, and so forth. By means of a Freirean-based pedagogy that is inspired by Paulo Freire, of problem-proposing dialogic education, as research participants, we questioned these phenomena. We questioned if and how our immediate experiences, our biographies, our narratives, our experience in the social context that we inhabited and that we still inhabit, experiences such as waiting in a queue, getting a bad service from a state provider or a private provider, feeling trapped by bureaucratic red tape when you have to phone and then the form comes back and then you have to reapply, etc. How these experiences are linked to broader social power structures and processes that often entail systematic manipulation and systematic institutionalized inequalities. We also questioned how we positioned ourselves vis-à-vis these phenomena, because sometimes we can be also the perpetrators of these inequalities. We also questioned if and why, in some cases, we abstained from positioning ourselves. We say we don't have an opinion, but that also has an impact on what happens next. So we questioned also our own biases, religious. As you know, Malta is a predominantly Catholic country, partisan. In Malta, for many years, we had a bi-party parliamentary structure. Only recently, after many years, after decades, we see a third party in parliament, but only in coalition with the opposition. We also questioned ideological biases, left-leaning, right-leaning, why, how, in what issues. Some people might be left-leaning in general, but then when it comes to the influx of migrants, for example, they might be more right-leaning. So in other words, we engaged with problematization and change that goes beyond self-empowerment. To make ourselves, as research participants in this Action Research Project, to make ourselves even more vulnerable, we disseminated this community-driven pedagogy that we had formulated together. We disseminated it within the community, but we also capitalized on participants' homegrown social capital, our networks. For example, we capitalized on my role within the University of Malta and beyond to disseminate the cultural circle's work in international and scholarly fora, such as the popular Education Network Conference. Consequently, my role as a research assistant, my role as a junior academic at the bottom, so to say, of the academic food chain, a role that could generally be described as precarious and associated therefore with vulnerability, in that occasion, on those occasions, was transformed into an opportunity. Why? Because as the months unfolded, remember this was a longitudinal research project, within this community-based educational initiative, the desire became to educate for socio-political activation and individual collective liberation vis-à-vis the existing oppressive structures, with the view to transform these structures in the process. The research data obtained comprised evidence of critical awareness. We started questioning even the everyday things that we take for granted. Critical individual articulations, expressions of how the inequalities are affecting us and how sometimes we contribute to the prevalence of those inequalities. Discussions on systematic inequalities and issues. This engagement was then artistically expressed, because within the research group we had people who were folk song, Maltese traditional folk song enthusiasts, people who were enthusiasts about writing prose and poetry, using Maltese language, but also sometimes the dialect of the town, because although Malta is a small country, we still have some dialects here and there. Artistically expressed. The artistic expressions took the form of Maltese traditional song, prose, and poetic compositions in Maltese and dialect, because such artistic expressions were traditionally valued in the context of this particular community. Yet, although these people had been folk singers and writers, you know, for all their lives, and they were older adults, most of them, however, they had never used their artistic talents to express freedom-based critical engagement with the issues that I mentioned earlier, climate change, public services, etc. Moreover, the use of traditional folk song and prose in dialect also gave voice to underlying, predominantly silent struggle of the community that often experiences depreciation of such artistic forms. People are, in general, wouldn't be so interested in folk song, no, and in poetry in dialect. It would be a niche area, because the broader artistic scene is commercialized pop, as we know. In this sense, my action research comprised an adult education initiative that used the community setting. And this is why today I wanted to speak about a community-driven pedagogy. The community setting was used to foster the often repressed tradition of adult education that extends beyond the restricted domain of welfarism. But how is all this related to vulnerability, to vocational educational training, and to my personal and professional narrative, my life story, and my career progression in academia? Well, some years later, while I was struggling with preparing a powerful defense for my doctoral study, I stumbled over the work of research professor Brené Brown. One of the numerous yields of her 15 years of research on vulnerability, courage, worthiness, and shame is a manifesto entitled Manifesto for the Brave and the Broken-Hearted. It starts like this. There is no greater threat to the critics and cynics and fearmongers than those of us who are willing to fall because we have learned how to rise. Adult education is emancipatory when it provides safe spaces for people who are learners, but also the educators. We need safe spaces as educators, as policymakers, to put ourselves out there, willing to invest time and energy to make a contribution that we believe in, willing to have our work judged, willing to fall. As adult learners, educators, and policymakers, we show up. We put down our defenses, and that is what vulnerability is in the end. Putting down our defenses, showing up, and be open to any criticism and any faults and shortcomings that might result. In other words, we become vulnerable. Eventually, the findings of my own doctoral research confirmed that not only there is no escape from vulnerability, because in some way or another we are all or can all be vulnerable, but also that escape from vulnerability is not recommended, because vulnerability can translate into positive opportunities. Yet, where does this leave us? Where do we go from here? Some of the opportunities that may sprout from vulnerabilities are indeed worrying. To mention one example, when widowed at just 21 years of age, Zera Duman, so she was a widow, 21 years of age, with a Muslim background, emerged as a recruiter of a jihadi brides using apps to send encrypted messages. So there you have skill, technological skill, but combined with a socio-political context that resulted in terror. Of course, this is one bad example, and sometimes, as you know, the bad examples make more noise than the good ones. But we have to be aware that these opportunities can be transformed, as testified by this and other current events, these opportunities for vulnerability to become something else. Vulnerability may be an opportunity that beacons terror, as well as our terrified responses to that terror. We have to be critical also of our terrified responses to terror. My doctoral research delved into how education, and more specifically adult education in community settings, is pivotal to experience vulnerabilities as positive opportunities, particularly when engaging with otherness, with what is strange and unfamiliar. As education professor Gerd Biesta argues, when this occurs within an educational and not just a learning setting, there is a relationship, learning is just one way, we get an emancipatory opportunity for coming into presence. This approach antagonizes another type of so-called adult education, the type of adult education that frames the call to pursue efforts and achievements on a lifelong basis, yet only to fuel what social policy analyst Tony Fitzpatrick refers to as the hedonic treadmill that hooks us onto the challenge of an unwinnable race. So you get this diploma, but it's not enough. You get that degree, and it's not enough. You get a master's, and it's not enough. A PhD, and it's not enough. A postdoctorate, and it's still not enough. And this is in academia, but it applies to all sectors, vocational, educational, and training and development sectors, as you know. To be fair, one definition of the term challenge is to prove or justify oneself. Yet the genuineness of context within which we are being asked to prove ourselves is highly arguable. Is it a genuine context? Indeed, we have this maxim that urges us to get out of one's comfort zone, and it's used broadly. Whether you are training to become more fit, get out of your comfort zone. Whether you're training to play an instrument, get out of practicing, get out of your comfort zone. Try something more difficult. But this phrase is increasingly being deployed as a control meme, as a catchphrase that has gone viral to reinforce an oppressive status quo. For what comfort would we be getting out of in the first place when many of us embark on lifelong learning, particularly in adulthood, in vain hope of overcoming pre-existing difficulties? So we wouldn't be comfortable when we embark on lifelong learning. We would be uncomfortable, and that's why we would be embarking on lifelong learning. In this sense, lifelong learning is not emancipatory education, but simply an exploitative ladder to climb up a downward escalator of institutions that, constrained by the post-Fordist brunt of globalization and marketization, are increasingly resourced by a fragmented, peripheral, precarious, secondary labor market model that constantly depreciates the value of our efforts and achievements, and in so doing, our dignity. My research agenda, my personal life as well, prioritizes the identification and understanding of challenges in adult education that are genuine because they are emancipatory. My understanding of emancipation draws on the sociological analysis of Tom Inglis that distinguishes between empowerment, which implies improving one's condition within the existing system, even though the existing system is overdone by inequality. The most important thing is that I empower myself. And versus emancipation, when I obtain more power, but in so doing, whether it's more knowledge or more money or more status, in so doing, I struggle for freedom by challenging the system and by changing it. I'm not happy that I obtain power. I also want, my context to improve. So I started to research empowerment, but then I realized that that concept was not enough for me, personally and professionally, and that is how, thanks also to the guidance from my supervisors, I shifted my attention to emancipation. And I always make it a point to make this distinction between empowerment and emancipation. Many people say it's what's in a word. Fine, you can use empowerment as long as you also target the context and not just the self-advancement, which is, has an expiry date after all. In turn, this position that I have just explained is rooted in the works of Paulo Freire, who argued that it is not possible to be unfinished beings, such as we are. According to Paulo Freire, we are unfinished beings. If we were finished beings, life would not be interesting. There's nothing else, there's nothing left to do. It is not possible to be unfinished beings, such as we are, conscious of that inconclusiveness, conscious that there's more for us, and not seek. If we know there's more for us, we will seek to see what's next, what comes next. Education is precisely that seeking movement, that permanent search for alternatives. And as David Livingstone and Miloš Rajkov put it, once alternatives begin to be seen as needed, the previously inevitable, what we thought we cannot change, suddenly becomes intolerable. In conclusion, I urge decision makers present here today, of any level and any context, even if we're at the bottom of the food chain, we still make decisions. Be it a family member, the activist, the educator, the manager, the director or chief executive, the minister or his representatives, people who are concerned about the need for our society to challenge our vulnerability in a genuine and emancipatory manner. People who would like to learn about one way of doing this in a small community context. People who would like to enhance the role of educators. This is my invitation to all of you who are somehow associated with this position. I believe this needs to be addressed with immediate effect and starting from our immediate context. Think small. Our families, our communities, and last but not least, our universities. Because we should, but also because we can do it. For I concord with Freire also when in attributing historicity to human beings, he explains that it is living the dialectic of being able to and not being able to that satisfies my presence in the world, of a being that at the same time and for that reason is the object of history. We are the object of history. History has put us here in this room today, okay, through connections that perhaps we didn't have power over. So in that sense, we are the object of history. And once we recognize ourselves as such, once self-recognized as such, we can come to be the subject of history. Finally, allow me to dedicate this keynote to the memory of the mayor of the community that participated in my doctoral research, Mayor Joe Attard, who passed last Saturday after serving as mayor of his community that eventually became my community as well, although I was not born there, but through the research experience. He served his community for 21 years. I thank him. I am in loving memory of his memory. I couldn't attend his funeral because I was on my way here to speak to you. His funeral was held yesterday, but this is my tribute to him for the support and trust that he gave me, for welcoming me as a researcher, a scholar, and a friend, for walking the talk by valuing and investing in the indigenous capital of his community, and for the outstanding and wholehearted lifetime contribution he gave to his community till the very end. Thank you.